So, we've talked about the structural units of the nervous system. Now we're going to talk about how those cells conduct and process information. I'm throwing this up at first, even though we haven't talked about any of this, to just show you that there's kind of a cycle here. That one thing causes another thing to happen, which causes another, that eventually causes the first thing to happen. And the reason I like to show this up front is so that you realize that there's a point that I have to just jump in here. And so the astute student will say, well, wait a minute, I don't get how that first part started. And the thing is, I can't answer that question until I've explained everything that comes around. So there is a point where I just have to kind of jump into the circle, and you just got to kind of go with me about how that very initial thing got started. And because it'll eventually be explained. Because if I explain to you how that got started, then I got to keep backing up, and so just to know that. Well, I'll eventually come back up to this to kind of summarize what we've talked about. So the first question is, how do cells conduct and process information? So there are two main ways that information can be transmitted. It can be transmitted through a binary method or through an analog method. So a binary method is simply it exists or it doesn't exist. It's on or it's off. It's a light switch. It's off, it's on. Off, on. Off, on. Okay, binary. It either exists or it doesn't exist. On the other hand, we can have analog systems. Now, in analog systems, this is a continuous or a graded, there's degrees to it. So you have states in between simply being on or off. There's a space in between. There's not a dimmer switch in here, but that's if binary is simply a light switch turning on or off, analog is a dimmer switch where I can move it along a slider or turn the little knob, and I can set different intensities of the light to be all the way bright, be not on at all, or anywhere in between. And we're going to see this binary and analog systems coming out when we're describing how these neurons talk to each other. Sometimes they talk to each other in a binary sense, and sometimes they're going to talk to each other in an analog sense. So I've basically described this experiment before to you, but I'll do this again and go in a little more detail. So let's say I take a section of squid axon. Now, why squid axon? Well, there's an advantage to this, in that a squid axon is larger. One of the reasons is because it's an invertebrate and it doesn't have myelin. And later we'll talk about this, but since without myelin, the nerve transmission is going to be slower because it doesn't have that insulation. So one way you can counteract that is by increasing the diameter of the tube that you're sending it through. And so that's this the method that the squid axon uses to increase its nerve speed is to increase the diameter of it. So it makes for an axon segment that is more manageable to use in an experimental sense. So we can take a segment of squid axon, we can place it in a dish with some type of salt solution in it. And we can place an electrode into it. Now, how do you make an electrode that's small enough to get into the axon of a neuron? Because typically when we think of electrodes, we think of some type of metal wire or something that you can use to stick into something. But that's going to be really hard for us to do to get something small enough. So instead what they'll do is they'll take a glass pipette, take a long piece of glass, and they heat it up. And so you heat up a segment of it and you can draw it out to be incredibly fine. Where it's just, the very tip of it be incredibly fine, and you can then cut it there. And so what they'll make is they'll make a very small little portion of glass that's small enough to stick into a segment of of cell that we're interested in studying. Okay, but then how do you take the glass and then make it something that you can make as a recording electrode? Well, what you can do is then you can fill this up with some type of saltwater solution that will carry a charge to it. And then you can stick your wire in this side of it so that then the charge will carry through the salt water through the very fine tip of the glass electrode here, because the glass itself isn't going to conduct the electricity, but the salt water inside of it will. And then the electrode sits down in there so the charge can go through there and then can go to my whatever meter I'm using to be able to read this. And so then I can have my reference electrode outside of the cell. And so I already said that if we set up a experimental manipulation like this, and we look at the difference between the inside and the outside of the neuron, that we'll see that the inside of the neuron is negative, has a negative charge in relation to the outside of the neuron. So we call this the resting membrane potential. That's what RMP stands for, the resting membrane potential. And a typical value for this would be about negative 70 millivolts. It's not always exactly that. That's kind of the typical number that's thrown out. But in real life, you could see anywhere from somewhere in the 50s to somewhere in the 90s. But kind of an average typical value you would see would be somewhere around negative 70 millivolts. So, what determines... Actually, this is probably better done on the chalkboard. This is what I don't like about these types of classrooms, that the board gets all covered up. In fact, I'm going to turn this off and write. Where'd I put my chalk? Nope, there. All right. So why is this? Why is it that the inside of a cell is negative in relation to the outside of the cell? This is really due to a certain group of ions that are very prevalent in the body. So first of all, what is our body mostly made of? Water. What kind of water? Salt water, right? And salt, regular old table salt. Do you know what that is, what it's composed of? Sodium chloride, okay? Sodium and chloride. So we have a bunch of sodium and a bunch of chloride floating around in our body. Okay? Little chemistry lesson. Sodium is Na, and it carries a positive charge to it. Chloride is Cl with a negative charge to it. Okay? This is charged positively. This is charged negatively. Okay? Another really important ion is going to be potassium. Potassium is a K, and it carries a positive charge to it. Later we'll talk about calcium, and that's Ca with 2 positive charges to it, and that's about it. We're going to on the chemistry, remembering the periodic table. Okay. So these 3 ions play a very important part to the creating the resting membrane potential. There's also other organic anions. Anion is what you call a negative ion. Cation is what you call a positive ion. And so they're there, they're important, but they're not as important. They're not really, we don't really need to talk about them, discuss them in order to talk about this. So they exist, they're there, but disregard them for now. Well, for the rest of this class. Okay. Now, these ions exist in different concentrations, whether you're talking about inside of a cell or outside of a cell. So let's set that up. Let's set out that we have the inside of a cell and we have the outside of a cell. And I already said that the inside of the cell is negative and the outside of a cell would then be positive. Now, we already said that most of our body is made up of salt water, right? And that's sodium and chloride. So it probably shouldn't be a surprise to you that outside of the cell, we have lots of sodium and chloride. And I'm going to use the incredibly scientific way of notating that by writing it bigger. So there's lots of sodium, and on the inside of the cell, relative to that, there's not as much sodium. And there's lots of chloride, And on the inside of the cell, there's not as much. Now, potassium, on the other hand, is going to be different. There's lots of potassium inside of the cell, and there's not as much outside of the cell. So this is important. Remember this. This sets up everything. Everything about how our neurons communicate is based on this setup right here. All right, now, there are two fundamental forces in nature. I've actually already talked about one of them. These are things that will happen without any kind of input into the system, without any kind of energy needing to be expended in any way. One of them is the concentration gradient. For the concentration gradient, basically, things in high concentration will move toward areas of low concentration. So it turns out molecules are a lot like people. Okay? We like our personal space. So if you have an area where everything starts getting a little crowded and things start feeling a little uncomfortable, feeling uncomfortable? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right. We don't like this. We don't like being crowded. Okay. So if it was possible, she would scoot her chair over, right? She wants to move. If I was going to lecture from here the whole time, she might politely go move over to the other part of the class. Yep. Classroom. Okay. So molecules are the same way. They want to seek out areas of low concentration. They want to move from high concentration to low concentration. Imagine this silly scenario. Imagine that I could put a glass wall right across the middle of this room. And let's assume this room is completely airtight. And then I take a vacuum pump and I remove all of the air from this side of the room and throw it over here. So all the air is over here. No air over here. And then as soon as I get that, I then remove the glass wall. What is the air going to do? It's going to stay right over here, and that side's going to remain a vacuum, right? No. We have an area of high concentration and an area of low concentration. And that air is going to all of a sudden rush from this side, and it's probably going to go too much. And so this area is going to have high concentration, that area is going to have low, and it's going to come back, and then it's going to settle so that there's equal amounts of air on both sides of the room. Okay? That's the concentration gradient. I don't have to set up a series of fans to blow the air from this side of the room to this side of the room. It's just going to move on its own. Now, I did have to take a series of vacuum pumps to evacuate the air. Why? Because that would be moving against the concentration gradient. If I put that glass wall there, and I want to move all the air from this side of the room over here, I'm going to need energy to do that. Because all of a sudden I'd be taking molecules from low concentration and putting them in the area of a high concentration. That'd be against its concentration gradient. That'd be the opposite of diffusion. So I would need vacuum pumps. I would need to put energy into and work to move things against its concentration gradient. But then once I remove that glass wall, I don't need any energy. I don't need a fan to blow this. I don't need pumps. It will naturally move from high concentration to low concentration. And chemicals work the same way. So if you have more sodium outside of a cell than inside of the cell, sodium is going to want to get inside the cell. It's going to want to move. And so I'm going to use an arrow to represent this. By its concentration gradient, sodium wants to come inside of the cell. How about chloride? How would it want to move? It would want to move inside of the cell. How about potassium? How would it want to move? It would want to move outside of the cell. Okay, so that's the concentration gradient, also known as diffusion. The next concept is the electrical gradient. We've already mentioned this. Opposites attract. So positive wants to go where it's negative, negative wants to go where it's positive. Positives want to repel each other, negatives want to repel each other. So, I'm going to depict electrical gradient by a dashed line. If I have positive sodium, where would positive sodium rather be? Inside of the cell or outside the cell? Inside the cell, because the inside of the cell is negative, and positive sodium would rather be where it's negative. So sodium, by its electrical gradient, would rather be inside of the cell. Okay, how about negative chloride? Would it rather be inside or outside the cell? Outside the cell, because negative chloride wants to be where it's positive. So chloride, by its electrical gradient, would rather be outside of the cell. How about potassium? Where does positive potassium want to go? Inside of the cell, because positive potassium wants to be where it's negative. So you can see, as long as you remember the concentration gradient and whether it's positive or negative, you can work out all the electrical and the concentration gradient issue. High concentration wants to be where it's low concentration. Positive wants to be where it's negative, and negative wants to be where it's positive. Okay. Now, as you can see, sodium really wants to get inside of the cells. Okay? This is the really cool party in here, and he just really, really wants to get in there by both its concentration and its electrical gradient. Sodium really wants to get inside of the cell. The problem is the cellular membrane is not permeable to sodium, so sodium can't get in. Now, I can't say completely that it can't get in, because it really wants to get in so bad. Sodium occasionally sneaks through the fire exit. Occasionally their buddy, kind of hides them behind there and they get past the bouncer. They occasionally sodium sneaks in, but for the most part, sodium is not permeable and sodium can't get in. It doesn't have the invite. But because it wants to get in by both its electrical and concentration gradient, it occasionally leaks in, and that's okay. We have bouncers inside the cell that'll take care of that. We'll talk about that later. But for the most part, so the cellular membrane is not permeable to sodium, so sodium can't get in. Now, chloride, on the other hand, by its concentration gradient wants to go into the cell, but by its electrical gradient wants to go out. For the most part, they kind of cancel each other out. Not completely. Of that negative 70 millivolts, about 10 of those are attributable to chloride. So it does play some role, but it doesn't play a major role in this. Because for the most part, they kind of, they just kind of cancel each other out by coming in or out. On the other hand, though, potassium. Much more potassium leaves the cell than comes back into the cell. And so this inequity, the fact that more positive ions leave the cell than come back into the cell, is the biggest single contributing factor to why the cell is negative on the inside and positive on the outside. Why the resting membrane potential. And when I say resting membrane potential, I do mean at rest. When the neuron's not doing anything, particularly when it's not communicating. When the neuron's just sitting there at rest, then this is describing what's going on. So the resting membrane potential around negative 70 millivolts. Potassium is the largest single driver of why there's that negative charge there. The fact that more potassium leaves than comes back in. More positive ions are leaving the cell than coming back in. Now, there is another process that's going in here, because if this was all that was going on, we would call the cell at equilibrium. That this is where, if we just set everything up and we just let the cell do its thing, then this would be its equilibrium point. But the resting membrane potential is not a true equilibrium. Instead, it's something that we call a steady state. The reason we call it steady state is that you actually do need to apply energy to the system to maintain it. You can't indefinitely have potassium constantly leaving the cell and everything going to be okay. And quite frankly, sodium eventually is going to get in. It's going to sneak into the cell. And you really need to have, if you get too much sodium in here, sodium's positive, and if you keep letting sodium keep sneaking in over and over and over, eventually the cell's going to start becoming more positive. And that's not a good thing, because all this rest of the stuff depends on the inside cell being negative. So you need to have a mechanism that's going to help replenish potassium back into the cell and is going to remove sodium out of the cell. And this is the mechanism known as the sodium-potassium pump. And what the sodium-potassium pump does is it brings potassium back into the cell while expelling sodium out of it. Particularly, it will remove three ions of sodium out of the cell and bring 2 potassium back in. And for every time it does that, it uses 1 ATP. Remember I said that's our energy currency there. So it has to forcefully do that because sodium really doesn't want to leave. By both its concentration gradient and its electrical gradient, it really wants to stay there. So if I want sodium to leave, I'm going to have to use energy. The bouncer's going to have to come, grab sodium, and forcefully throw them out the door. Because it's against both its concentration and its electrical gradient. So it's going to require energy in order to do that. And the same thing with potassium. Because potassium's on its way out, more potassium leaves the cell. So if I want to get it back in, I'm going to require energy. I'm going to have to go out to the street, say, hey, you, come with me, grab them, and bring them inside. It's going to require energy in order to do that. And this is what keeps everything in balance. This is what helps prevent sodium from slowly building up in the cell. And this is what keeps potassium at high concentration inside the cell, even though it wants to leave faster than it comes in. Now, this is basically, think of this as what maintains it. The resting membrane potential is mostly due to potassium. The potassium is what contributes the largest portion to the negative charge of the resting membrane potential. The sodium-potassium pump is just kind of what helps maintain the system so that all the rest of this works. This is not driving the resting membrane potential. It just helps keep the system going. Potassium is what's really driving the resting membrane potential. But you can see this. Take something like in a stroke, where all of a sudden we cut off blood supply. And now we've cut off the supply of nutrients to the neurons. And so therefore, the neurons aren't going to be able to produce new ATP. And so therefore, the ATP is going to go away and the cells aren't going to be able to, these sodium-potassium pumps aren't going to be able to operate anymore. So slowly, potassium would penetrate in and would destabilize the cell by turning it positive. Though in a minute, as we talk about how the neuron actually communicate, you can see how we can actually speed that up and how that can actually lead to the death of a neuron. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so this is the neuron at rest. Now we have set the stage for how a neuron can talk. Okay, so let's go back to my cartoon neuron here. And let's say I need to send information from this neuron to another neuron. Now, you'll notice that I drew a little bump here. I did that on purpose. I'm going to call this, well, I'm not going to call it this. Other people called it. We're calling this the axon hillock. 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 And this is notable because at this point there are a large number of what we call sodium voltage gated channels. Okay, so remember that we had channels we talked about earlier, and there's two types of channels. There are channels that are resting channels that are always open, and there are gated channels. They're sometimes open, sometimes closed. Okay? Now, these sodium channels, they're closed, right? We don't want sodium getting in. But there are some times where we have a signal that tells these voltage gated, and I call them voltage gated because it depends on a change in the voltage of the neuron that then signals these channels to open. So let's say that we could stick an electrode into the neuron and we could measure what's going on with its membrane potential. So we'll say this axis is time and this axis is voltage. Okay? So we have our negative 70 millivolts here. And so if we just stuck an electrode in and measured over time of a neuron that wasn't doing anything, it would just hang here at the resting membrane potential, right? It's not doing anything. So over a second of time, it's just hanging out there at the resting membrane potential. But if I send it a signal that changes the voltage in a positive direction, this is known as depolarization. If you change the membrane potential toward the positive, you are depolarizing the neuron. You can also do the opposite. You can make a neuron more negative. If you make a neuron more negative, that's called hyperpolarization. So depolarize, more positive, hyperpolarize, more negative. So in order to activate these voltage-gated sodium channels, I need to depolarize the neuron. This is the point where you say, how do you depolarize the neuron? And this is the point where I say, I can't tell you that yet. We'll get to it eventually. Okay, so by some magical process, we're going to depolarize the neuron. Once we've depolarized the neuron about 15 millivolts, that will be the trigger zone. That is what that voltage-gated channel is looking for there to be a change of about 15 millivolts. We call that the threshold of excitation. So, when we hit that point, when you hit that about negative 55 millivolts, that is what's going to trigger the voltage-gated sodium ion or its channels to open up. Now, looking at this scenario, I said sodium doesn't come in because the cellular membrane is not permeable to sodium. Now, what would happen if all of a sudden I opened the doors for sodium? What would it do? It's going to rush in, right? Because by both its concentration and its electrical gradient, sodium really wants to get in. So if all of a sudden I throw open the doors and I say sodium free for all, they're going to rush in. So when I hit that threshold of excitation, I'm going to open the doors for sodium. I'm actually just going to skip over chloride because all this really has to do with sodium and potassium. So chloride's still there. It still exists. It's still doing its thing. But let's just talk in terms of potassium and sodium for right now. Okay. So if I go and I open up the sodium doors, sodium really wants to get in. By both its electrical and its concentration gradient, sodium really wants to get in. And so that's exactly what's going to happen. Sodium's going to rush into the cell. And all of a sudden we're going to change the concentration so that now there is lots of sodium inside of the cell, and right outside the cell there's relatively smaller amounts. But in doing that, by bringing all these positive ions inside of the cell, we're going to change the inside of the cell positive, and the outside of the cell will then become negative. Oh, thank you. Thanks. I did that on purpose, see if you're paying attention. Okay. So, all this sodium's going to rush in, and it's actually going to change the cell to be positive. So what you're going to see, if you're looking at this, once again, this is time marching forward. So, when we hit that threshold of excitation, boom, we're going to see this rapid shift to the cell becoming positive. I don't know, maybe about positive 40 millivolts. Now, these doors don't stay open forever. I mean, it's a fraction of a second. We're just going to open the door. Sodium's going to just trample in, change the entire environment, and then we're going to close the door again. So sodium rushes in, and then boom, door's closed. So at this point here, at the threshold of excitation, voltage gated sodium channels open. And at the very peak of this is where the same voltage-gated sodium channels are going to close. So when we close that, no more sodium can get in. But now we got a bunch of sodium in here. It's completely changed the dynamic of the place. We went from a negative place to a positive place now. So think about poor potassium. This was potassium's place. There was lots of potassium in here. Positive potassium liked being where the cell was negative. But now we've changed that. Now the inside of the cell is positive. So let's think this through. By its concentration gradient, which way should potassium want to move? In or out of the cell? Out, right, because large concentration wants to move to small concentration. Now by its electrical gradient, which way does potassium want to move? Out, because now the positive potassium wants to be where it's negative. So we're going to switch its electrical gradient. So now, by both its concentration gradient and by its electrical gradient, potassium wants out. And in fact, we're even going to help that along. Because when we opened up those doors to let sodium in, we're also going to open up some potassium voltage-gated channels. The only thing is, it just takes a little longer to open those doors. So they're going to really start opening somewhere around here. So the potassium channels are going to open. So once we've closed the sodium doors and we've changed the cell positive, potassium really wants to get out of there. So by its both concentration and its electrical gradient, this positive ion potassium is going to leave out of the cell, changing the concentration. And by doing that, by removing all of that positive ion out, we're going to then hyperpolarize the cell. So people describe that as repolarization, because we're just returning it back as it was. I mean, we're moving in the negative direction, so we're hyperpolarizing it, but like I said, people commonly refer to that as repolarization. Actually, it's going to overshoot. It's actually going to, when we look at it, we're going to see something like this. It's going to overshoot negative 70, and then it's going to get back to the resting membrane potential. Now, during this period, we have something called the refractory period. Now, whether you know it or not, you're actually really familiar with refractory periods, because you probably have a toilet in your home. And the toilet is the perfect example of a refractory period. A home toilet, not like one you have in the office. So in a residential commode, you flush it. The water goes out. So what happens if, right after you flush it, what happens if you hit the little handle again? Nothing, right? It just ding, ding, ding. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't flush it again. Because in order for it to flush, it has to get all back in the system. There's a certain amount of water that needs to be in the tank, a certain amount that needs to be in the bowl. Everything needs to be set up for when you hit the lever for gravity to do its thing and to flush the water out. So that is the refractory period of that toilet. That no matter how much you sit there and jiggle that handle, it will not flush again. Now that's called the absolute refractory period. Now there's a period in there when it's filling up that it hasn't quite completely filled up again, but there's a point where you can hit that and it does a little wimpy flush, right? Okay, that's the relative refractory period. That you can give it a little wimpy flush because everything hasn't fully reset. It's partially reset. It's enough where water will flow out, but it doesn't do its normal thing. And so the neuron's the same way. There's a period in this refractory period where absolutely the neuron will not fire again. That's not an absolute line. I'm just doing this to illustrate. So there's a period where absolutely, no matter what you do to that neuron, it will not fire again. But then there's another part of that period where things have reset enough where if you give it enough stimulation, it'll do a little wimpy. It'll do a little wimpy thing, but it won't really do this. It won't work the same way. So this is the refractory period. So this whole thing here, what I've just described to you, is the action potential. The action potential is the basis of neuronal communication. This is the nervous impulse. This is how a neuron talks to another, is through the action potential. Now, as you can imagine here, at the end of the action potential, after we've had this rapid depolarization, then repolarization, everything's screwed up here, right? Because this is not how the neuron looks at rest. This is why it can't fire again. Because if we open up voltage-gated channels right now, it's not going to act in the same way. Sodium's not going to come rushing into the cell again because the concentration gradient's off. I guess we have returned it at this point where the inside's negative and the outside's positive. But that's about all. The concentration is all screwed up. So how can we fix this? How can we get the concentration gradient back to the way it looks at rest? Get the bouncer. So we can use these sodium-potassium pumps. Because the sodium-potassium pump takes potassium, brings it inside, and takes sodium and expels it out. So the sodium-potassium pumps can kick in and bring potassium in and expel sodium out. There's also just going to be some diffusion going on as well. All this potassium, your body's big, especially when you're talking about in relation to a single neuron. So some of this potassium here is just going to float away. So it doesn't have to actually grab every bit of it and throw it back in there. Part of this is just going to, and there's a lot of sodium in your body. And so some of this sodium for the rest of your body is going to float in here as well. So some of it's going to happen through diffusion, and some of it, and also your cells are really big too. The action potential is really quite small. We're just going to turn this one little area positive right here. And the cell is huge in relation to that. So some of this positive sodium here is just going to migrate to the rest of the cell. And there's going to be potassium from the rest of the cell that's going to migrate into that area. So the sodium potassium pumps aren't 100%. They're needed. This is what happens when during a stroke and we lose blood flow and we lose this sodium potassium, that once you fire the action potential, it's really hard for it to reset. And so then it can't fire again. And then you're stuck with too much sodium inside. And too much sodium causes a problem. You can actually have where so much sodium gets inside a cell that you actually change the concentration gradient of water, where there will be higher concentrations of water outside of the cell than inside the cell, because your inside the cell is so much a higher salt water level, the salty aspect of it. So water will start following concentration gradient and coming into the cell, which will cause the cell to swell. And then your body says, uh-oh, that cell is swelling. It must be sick. And so the immune system is going to go then attack that cell and kill it. So you have a stroke, you lose energy coming in. You then, this is only one of the things. There's other things that go on as well. But one of the things is that then your cells swell, your immune system attacks them, and then kills off all your cells for you. Your immune system does a lot to kill you. It's really good. It does a lot to keep you alive. The fact that we're all alive right now is because our immune system works well. But there's a lot of things that actually cause your immune system to then turn on the body and then do things as well. There's also excitotoxic lesion that happens because of excess sodium and calcium and everything. But anyways, okay. So the sodium potassium pumps is important, though, for reestablishing your resting membrane potential, for resetting everything back to the way it is so that it can fire the next action potential. Now, as I started off, I said that this happens at the axon hillock. The axon hillock has a large concentration of these voltage-gated sodium channels. So this is where the signal starts. But we want to get this signal, we want to be able to talk to this next neuron. So somehow this signal has to move down the axon. So let's blow up this segment here. Let's look at a segment of axon. So at the beginning of the action potential, normally the cell is negative on the inside of it and positive on the outside. Okay, so we have the change in voltage that's going to activate that threshold of excitation and is going to open sodium channels. So I'm going to have sodium come into the cell, and that's going to change this area of the cell positive and change out here negative. Oh, yeah, it's positive. Okay. Now, we're going to then close that off, and we're going to then open potassium. And we're going to let potassium leave the cell. Now, while potassium's leaving, we have raised the voltage area over here, because now we got this positive ions here, and these positive ions the sodium is going to migrate a little bit, and it's going to change, and so therefore it's going to open up new sodium channels. And so new sodium is going to rush in, and it's going to change this area positive and change this area negative. While on the back side here, potassium is leaving, changing this back negative, restoring the positive outside. But now we got everything. So now the sodium potassium pumps are going to be back over here, and they're going to be working to restore everything so that it's back to normal. All while over here, these new sodium channels are going to be opening up new sodium channels. Exactly. And so this is slowly moving, and then sodium channels are going to close, potassium channels are going to open, so potassium's going to be leaving, therefore changing this back negative. So now there's no longer a distinction here. So now we're back negative over here, but this area, because new sodium's moved in, is now positive, and that just keeps going on down the road. So this constant exchange of opening up new sodium channels and then potassium channels on the back side of it is going to cause that action potential to propagate down the length of the axon. Within the sodium potassium pumps, then restoring the concentration of the sodium and the potassium so that a new action potential can follow it. So that's just going to work its way on down. No, this happens when the initial cell has to be stimulated in some way. It has to say, I want to send information on. That's the part that becomes, I can't really explain that but it gets stimulated. That's then going to cause it to initially build up that positive charge that's going to open up the first set of voltage-gated sodium channels. Now, this is an effective way to send the information down the system. This is just kind of a better illustration showing how as you're moving down the surface of the axon, how the sodium ions are coming in, and they are then opening up future sodium channels, while on the backside, potassium channels are opening up as the sodium's closed. Potassium opens up and allows it to leave, so that we have this along the length of the axon, you have this one depolarized area where the inside is positive, and how then that propagates down, while on the backside of it remains negative, remains negative after the potassium then leaves, and then sodium potassium pumps help facilitate turning back, getting the right concentration of sodium and potassium ions so that it can follow another action potential. Now, this works. The problem with sending an action potential like this is that it's slow. Because constantly channels are opening and closing, and sodium potassium pumps and all this. It takes a little bit to do this. So there is a faster way to do this, and that's using myelin. So in segments of the axon that are covered in myelin, it can't do all this opening sodium and potassium channels and everything. They're closed off. There's this big old cell in the way. So what happens is that the neuronal signal, the action potential, the positive ions that are brought in, those sodium ions, are just simply propagate down in these areas of myelination, because positive is attracted to negative. So if you have all these positive ions and then all the rest of inside of the axon is negative, then they're going to want to go and follow that. They're going to go, hey, I want to be where it's negative. And it does this quite quickly. In fact, they call it saltatory conduction. And that's like French for skipping, I think. Because that's the way it looks. It looks like the action potential is skipping down the axon. Because the problem with this is, you can see the sodium ions don't all stay there all nice together. They start to spread out. And so if that was the only way that you had to go from the beginning of the axon to the end, those sodium ions would just spread out, and then they would kind of lose, and then you wouldn't even notice them anymore. So you have to have areas where you can regenerate this signal. And that's where the nodes of Ranvier come in. That when the sodium ions then skip to the next segment, they're then going to open up sodium channels, and we go through that whole process again. So it moves quite quickly through the segment of myelin and then slows down at the node while the signal regenerates and then skips again. I have a little animation to show that.
An action potential, represented by a red strip, spreads along an unmyelinated axon and depolarizes the axon membrane ahead. This depolarization leads to the opening of sodium channels. Since there are sodium channels along the entire length of the axon membrane, the action potential is actively regenerated at every point along the axon, and thus advances toward the terminal boutons at a constant rate. An action potential spreads along a myelinated axon. When it reaches a node of Ranvier, the action potential is regenerated. It then continues along the myelin-covered segments via passive conduction, in a fast but decaying fashion. Thus, action potentials in a myelinated axon advance via saltatory conduction, actively regenerated at each node of Ranvier, while passively conducted between the nodes. In this segment, the conduction in the two types of axons is compared. Due to the passive conduction along the myelinated segments, saltatory conduction in myelinated axons is up to 15 times faster than the conduction in unmyelinated axons. Saltatory conduction is also more efficient. Less sodium enters the axon in its myelinated segments. Thus, less energy is required to maintain the sodium balance by the sodium-potassium pumps.
So I think this is actually a really good point to end it for today, because the next segment will be then, okay, what happens? So what? This action potential then moves down the length of the axon, but then how does that then communicate to the next neuron or to the muscle or to the gland? So that's where we'll pick up next week.